Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. My name is Aidan McKeeker, one of the project officers here at the International Association for Political Science Students, Oceania region. On behalf of IAP's Oceania projects team, I'm delighted to introduce this event, Addressing Democratic Deficit in the 21st Century. Our speaker tonight is Patrick Marple, a PhD candidate in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University's Faculty of Arts. He is an expert in Australian politics, electoral theory and public policy, and is currently undertaking cutting-edge research into independence and how they are able to win parliamentary representation. The format for this event will run for approximately 1 hour, with Patrick presenting for approximately 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A at the end. All viewers can put forth their questions using the chat option on Zoom. Furthermore, this event will be recorded and made available to global IAPS members. Thank you, Patrick. The floor is yours.
Marvelous. Well, thank you very much, Aidan, and welcome to everybody. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you guys tonight. It's always very exciting to get involved with these kind of things. Normally, I'm used to sitting here in front of a bunch of students who don't say anything. So this is well, I mean, we don't know yet, but I'm sure it'll be a pleasant diversion from that. So yes, so thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Just prior to this, we've been trying to work out some technical difficulties with it. So let's hope it does actually work. So I believe the procedure was to go share screen here, share, and present, and then just bear with me, everybody. Hopefully you can see that, and I'm just going to, because it's mirrored, I'm just going to see if presenter view fixes anything, so that you're not. Are you guys? Aidan, are you seeing the presenter view, or are you seeing the seeing just the presentation?
I am seeing the first slide of the full picture of the
Brilliant.
structure.
That's great. Marvelous. Excellent. All right, we'll kick off. So this is my very airily titled, the working title for the kind of research that I've been doing at Monash, which is looking at independent politicians, as Aidan has said. Flash in the pan or future trend. I mean, I leave it up to you guys whether or not that's a particularly good title. But I guess introductions are probably in order from my end. Hi, everyone. I'm Patrick. I teach and I work at Monash University. I do most of my research there. I also work on, do a lot of public policy based things. Some of you, if any of you are Monash students and you have gone through a politics degree, you may have had me as a tutor at some point or another, because that's my other area of expertise is public policy. I guess I apologize as well for the for the slideshow. It looks like it's done all in primary colors by a 7-year-old. It's because I was very hastily mashing everything together to try and be prepared. So I was getting PowerPoint to do it all for me. So anyway, that's fine. So we'll move swiftly on. So I guess I really wanted to address the main premise of what tonight was about and to link it to the research that I'm doing, because I do believe they are connected. So as Aidan has already mentioned, really tonight is all about the perceived, I suppose, democratic deficit that many people are worried about even into 2021, despite some of the more positive aspects that might have occurred last year in 2020. Electorally speaking, anyway, maybe not in other realms, but definitely in terms of elections, particularly the US election. I know that was it was a huge election, the highest turnout that's ever occurred, and for many Democrats, I suppose, a very a wonderful time. But yeah, so really, I suppose the first thing I wanted to do was just kind of like explore this idea about a democratic deficit, and particularly around civic participation and political participation. So I love a meme, so I've put a few up there. I love a good Simpsons meme as well. I grew up on the Simpsons. So anyway, so there has actually been a great deal of survey work, which I will come to in a moment, done on Australia's this eroding trust in our democratic in our democracy, you know, confidence in our democracy, as well as confidence in our institutions. That is often, but you know, I'll come to the graphs for that later. That's often connected in many ways to what is seen as a more general anti-party malaise that exists within the community. You know, these feelings of being ignored, they're unable to really, you know, these feelings of not being able to participate, or that somehow participation is meaningless or phony. You know, we've all heard it at dinner parties and on the street, in public transport, you know, people saying, oh, it doesn't matter who I vote for. You know, it's always A or B will win and who cares? And it's this, you know, this feeling that it is a real major party game, that politics in Australia at any rate is all about a contest between parties. And it's not really about, you know, the representation of the local citizenry. I'll jump onto the graphs, I guess. So I just teasing out some of the statistics for this. It was done. There was a lot done in 2018 and 2019. In 2018, there was a study done was in the conversation. I've just kind of screen captured some of the pieces from it there that found that confidence in our you know, in our democracy, our satisfaction with our democracy was down to 41%, which is, that's a shocking statistic for anybody, particularly those of us working in political science. And it caused I remember when it came out, it caused a great deal of ripples back then. It was, you know, it's down from, what was it? Down from a really, really high over the 80s in 2007, which was of course the wonderful Kevin 07 election, where we had a big change of government. Yeah, so it's almost halved. As well as that, in 2019, with the ANU, Ian McAllister, he's a very well-known political scientist in Australian politics at any rate. He was part of the 2019 electoral study with ANU. And as he said, the quote from him there is, you know, he's been doing this for 40 years and he's never seen such poor returns for public trust and for satisfaction in democratic institutions. So, you know, there is, at least in 2019, prior to 2020, there was this real feeling that Australians were fed up with their system. They were furious with it. It is, and you know, I think it is important to mention this because of the nature of what happened in 2020. It's really hard to say how this has changed, but I suspect that, judging from a lot of the opinion polls that are coming out, particularly given, you know, Newspoll, our most, as much as people can often hate News Limited, Newspoll is still our most accurate of our political polling agencies. You know, Newspoll seems to be indicating that confidence in our institutions and in our democracy and in our, you know, indeed even our politicians is really high after everything that occurred during the pandemic. So I think a lot of this we do need to take with a grain of salt, because things have changed and have changed dramatically. But we shall soldier on. Hopefully in the near future, perhaps later this year, we'll hear more about that, particularly if we have another federal election. So the interesting thing that you often find from this is that there doesn't appear to be, you know, even though people were fed up with parties, they're really not satisfied with their democracy, there isn't a correspondingly significant drop in either electoral turnout or in the rate of informal voting. This is a really interesting phenomenon that occurred in 2019, was that we have, as we always do in Australia, we have very high electoral turnout, you know, it's over 90%, and our rate of informal voting is really small. It's the places where it is high, and even then it's only, you know, tens of percent. It's not over 50% or anything like that. But the places where it is really high are areas of high disadvantage. Generally speaking, in the Northern Territory, where you have a lot of First Nations people who understandably, you know, I think for various reasons, will be informally voting. The other really interesting thing there is, just as a quick aside, is that the other place you find a lot of informal voting is in the inner city suburbs, the inner city local councils. It's really interesting. At a federal level, I mean, we do find that there are a lot of young people in the inner city who are informally voting or aren't turning out to vote. For the reasons for this, I haven't the foggiest, but it is one of the really interesting things that came out of the 2019 election that Nick Economou has done some papers on. He is a professor well, no, not a professor, sorry. I'm thinking about the American system. He's a lecturer at Monash University and a senior academic who's been working in this space for decades. So that hasn't occurred. We haven't had this drop. In fact, one of the really weird things is that what has occurred is, and these are from Anthony Green's blog, what has actually occurred is that we've seen minor party and independent support skyrocket in the past 30 years or so. And correspondingly, the major party vote has plummeted. Their primary vote, so the people who are putting a 1 next to the on the ballot when they're voting, the primary vote of major parties has just gone into the dirt. And we're finding now that more and more electorates, more and more representatives from the major parties are having to rely on the preferences from others, from minor parties and from independents, in order to actually get elected, which does, it suggests, I think, that instead of people being totally disengaged from this, they're not becoming apathetic, they're not, not going out to vote. Instead, they're engaged with our electoral system, and they're letting their dissatisfaction be known. They're participating in the kind of the most fundamental way we have, at least in Australia, to participate politically for the average citizen through their vote. So I'm not trying to somehow say that there's no democratic deficit in Australia or anything else like that. There's certainly still a discussion to be had there, but I think that one of the really interesting things about these statistics is that I do think it is showing that people are, they are engaged, they are listening. They're not closing their door and putting their head in the sand or anything like that. So one of the big, and this is where I'm about to do an excellent segue, a today tonight level of segue into my into the area that I research, which is independent politicians. So it's often seen, or at least it's theorized in the media and by various different political scientists, that the big winners from this, at least in terms of elections, is independents and minor parties. The Greens, One Nation, the Palmer United Party back in the day. So, and the area that I look at is independents. And I think they are particularly interesting for what we're looking at today, because of how they actually get elected, the new ways that they are looking at getting elected. Now, I understand that I'm behind time, so I'll speed up. So there has been, this is going to be a bit hacked, what I'm about to do with some graphics, but we'll see how we go. So independents have been getting a great deal of media attention lately and over the past 10 to 20 years. There's been several small books written about them, some papers done. There's a lot of rhetoric in the Guardian, particularly these days, about, Independence Day and they're coming, and there's this rising tide, this revolution that's on its way. They've had some really high-profile wins over the past few years, in the past 7 years, starting in 2013 with Cathy McGowan's win, and I've got each of them there. Starting in 2013 with Cathy McGowan's win against Sophie Mirabella, and then moving into 2018, the by-election after Turnbull was turfed out of the Liberal Party prime ministership, and he resigned. Karen Phelps won, and then in 2019 we had Zali Steggall defeat former Prime Minister Tony Abbott and take Warringah as well. And then also in 2019, we had Cathy McGowan resign. She resigned, she stepped down, she retired, and she passed what she called pass the baton. And everybody was quite shocked when Helen Haines won Indi again. It was huge. It was a huge deal that there could be an independent succession. And it's then led to a whole proliferation of things occurring. Primarily that they've just held a big conference of all of these independents, inviting various different community groups from around the country and other groups that I'll get to in a little bit, and bringing them all together to try and organize something a little bit more formal to try and get more independents elected, particularly women. yeah, at that, I was lucky enough to go to that convention to be able to, as a observer, and there was a lot of rhetoric about engaging local communities in politics, you know, particularly about getting more women elected to parliament. It occurred just before all of the horrible things started to be revealed about our federal parliament, so it was quite timely. And you know, there was a lot about rejecting party systems and this idea of representatives that want to listen and are active in the community. So there is all this rhetoric about, you know, a rising tide, that you know, there's some great conflagration of independence that is coming. But it is really hard to get elected as an independent in Australia. So to begin with, there's institutional hurdles. The system is built for parties, not for individuals who just, you know, for Joe Blow down the street who just, you know, wants to become a representative. You know, there's campaign experience that's required. There's an enormous amount of money that's also required. And there's fundraising experience that is needed there as well. Often that is held or knowledge that is jealously guarded by the political parties. And there's also just the fact that it's really difficult to break patterns of party voting in Australia. We're really loyal to we follow them like we follow football teams. It should be no mistake that organised politics and organised football teams occurred in similar times during the Industrial Revolution. But anyway, that again, as another tangent. So there are all these challenges to them, to independents getting elected. So it's, you know, is it actually the case? This is what we always have to do in academia. We have to kind of pass the hyperbole from the truth. Is it actually the case that there are all of these independents currently being elected, that somehow, you know, people who are disaffected with democracy are all, you know, rushing to anti-party, you know, independent candidates? And in terms of the statistics, it suggests that maybe yes, there is a rise, but it's a gradual one. It's not meteoric. It's not like it is for minor parties, for protest parties. It's not the same kind of sudden, you know, flash as it was for One Nation in the 90s, as has happened to the Greens, the Democrats, One Nation again in 2016. It's a really gradual thing. And that's also reflected in, you know, it's reflected in the numbers that we see in the parliament. So this is looking at this little table. I tried to make a timeline, realized it wouldn't work because there's too many numbers. This little table is looking at the numbers of independents that they have actually been elected to the federal parliament. And you can see it's gone up and then it's gone back down and it's gone up, and it's kind of plateaued at around 2 to 4. There was a real high watermark in 1996 when you had people like Pauline Hanson being elected. As an independent, she wasn't One Nation back then. This was before One Nation had ever, you know, appeared into the horror show of what it is now. So she appeared back then. And then you had many of the country independents being elected in the early 2000s. And then all of that, you know, gathered into the 2010 election, the minority Gillard government, who needed to be supported by independents, which is, I think, really where a lot of this rhetoric has first come from. Those moments of that occurring. From there in 2013, you had McGowan, and then you had Phelps winning at the by-election, and then you had Zali Steggall, and you had Helen Haynes winning in 2019. Unfortunately, we did see Phelps lose then as well, but we'll come to that in a moment. I guess what is really clear from all of this, and I know I'm racing through this, guys, what is really clear here, but it is actually harder to measure, right, is that their impact and their influence is increasing. Their numbers aren't that great, but comparably, the things that they can do are pretty impressive. So, you know, in terms of Oakeshott and Wilkie and Windsor in 2010, their electorates garnered huge concessions from the government for supporting Gillard's minority government. And then again, in after Phelps had won, she forced Morrison into minority government, and they were able to defeat the government on the floor of the House of the Representatives for the first time in, hang on, I'm trying to remember. I think it was 70 or 80 years. It had never happened never happened in 70 or 80 years. And they passed the Medivac bill, which is all about bringing refugees from I think it was Christmas Island back then, and Manus maybe, and to Australia in order to get care. And it was seen as a landslide moment. Everyone was shocked. The government was furious. And it was something that we as political scientists had just never seen before. So, you know, independents do appear to be enjoying this purely because of successively slim majorities, which perhaps also has something to do with the, you know, the nose plow of their primary vote, of major party primary votes. They can no longer rely on getting exaggerated majorities in parliament. So again, we come back to this, you know, this satisfaction with democracy, this democratic deficit, this anger that people have with, you know, their representation. So something else is also occurring here, and I'll be whiplash quick with this. In my research, what I've been doing, what I've really been looking at is really digging into these you know, 4 independents in particular, as opposed to the ones who were in the past. We're starting at Cathy McGowan, and I should say I'm actually from Indi, so it's an area of quite a lot of fascination for me. And what we're finding is something is changing about the types of independents that are getting elected and the way they do it. So we're finding that it's in all different electorates now, and that it's primarily women. It's no longer men. It used to be men, and it no longer is. I'll come to this one a little bit later, the split in a major party, because that is not quite so clear. You know, they're primarily blue ribbon Liberal seats. They're being won by women, and these are women who would have once been seen to be find their natural home in the Liberal Party. They are still very difficult to dislodge. That still holds true. They're no longer powerless in Parliament. They have enormous influence. They are still very much a lower house phenomenon. And in particular, because of Helen Haynes, they no longer disappear once they retire. The independent brand can continue. Once a successor is endorsed, the baton can be passed and they can win again, almost as if people are voting like they vote for parties, with that same kind of party loyalty. Yeah, so independent politics, types of independents getting elected, you know, it's changing dramatically. Aidan, how much time do I have? Do I have a little bit more?
Yeah, you can keep going for now. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. I just don't want to go over time. So yeah, so I guess at this point in time, you know, to kind of come back to this, what we were talking about before, this, you know, civic participation and democratic deficit. I did want to highlight another really interesting finding that I've discovered from really kind of getting to know these independents and getting to know how they are elected, and particularly with my intimate understanding of Indi as well, and what happened there in 2013. And it really is a story of new forms of civic participation, of new forms of political participation in our electoral system. Something different, something new is happening with how they're actually getting elected. Going back to this, you know, the changing paradigm, that they're no longer disappearing. Independents don't disappear anymore once they resign. Often we find it's because there's already this organic group, this grassroots, I suppose you could call them, group that is formed around the independent that can then just be transferred over to the next person. Remarkably like a party, but we'll come to that in a second. So this is, again, independence may not be rising, but something is, you know, increasing its representation, is really on the rise, which is the voices of. Some of you may have read about them in The Guardian. You may have seen them mentioned here or there. They're an incredibly influential group of people. They began in Indi in 2013. They coalesced around Cathy McGowan, and they were very much a response to anger about Sophie Mirabella. They were also partially formed by a bunch of young university students down in Carlton. In fact, I think I walk past the house that it occurred in quite regularly because my partner lives in Carlton. But we think that's where it all started, and they were all furious. They were university students, highly educated, very angry about the, you know, hardline conservative right wing Sophie Mirabella, did not like her at all. And there was also, they were able to pick up on that and connect it with general anger within the electorate as well, that not only was Mirabella perhaps more conservative than Indi was comfortable with, but she also wasn't representing them like they expected, like they wanted from somebody, you know, for their community. She didn't, there was this feeling that she didn't embody them anymore, that she wasn't really part of what made Indi. And this group who formed around them, they then met secretly in the library in Wangaratta, like it was, you know, during the days of 1944 in Germany or something, plotting the rebellion. And they were in there kind of, they all got together and they signed a charter of values and decided to try and to take on Mirabella by first engaging with the community with what they call these kitchen table conversations. And they went all across the electorate and they garnered all the information they could from people. They'd actually sit down with a whole group of families at kitchen tables and list all of their concerns down, and they ended up presenting it to Mirabella, who said quite promptly, "People of Indi are not interested in politics, go away." And they went away and they got organised, they selected a candidate, and McGowan ended up beating Mirabella. In fact, they've even established hubs, so these weird branches in various different towns and cities across the electorate of Indi that operate really a lot like branches do in political parties. And they're made up of professional advocates. Many of them had been advocates for decades prior. And the thing about the Voices for Indi, and this is my last point, I promise everybody, is that they're actually spreading, they're propagating out from their original purpose. So they've been going to other electorates and holding smaller conferences, smaller getting elected conferences, to try and spread education to local community groups about how they too can be listened to by their local member, including challenging the local member at election. And we saw other voices of groups appearing in local council elections after 2013. We saw them appearing in 2018 in the state election in Victoria for many of the seats within Indi and next to Indi. And then they spread in 2019 to Farrer, which is over the Murray River from Indi, and to Warringah, where Zali Steggall won. Since then, since the success of Steggall, they've then propagated even further, and they're popping up all over the place. At the last count, there's over 70 of them, and they all got together at this Getting Elected conference and signed a charter of values, and now they've got a Facebook page, and they've got all of these various other different sharing mechanisms, software. They use Nation Builder as well in order to coordinate campaigns. So it's really taking off in a huge way. We can probably leave the rest for questions and everything else. I just wanted to try and wrap it up, almost like a lecture. But you know that clearly Australia has attitudes about politicians and their satisfaction with democracy. Both of these things are not faring particularly well. But people are still engaged at the ballot box. They're still politically active. They're still going and voting, and they're still listening. And we really see that with the erosion of the major party vote. They appear to be shifting their vote to alternatives, one of which is independent candidates. And as we've seen, there is a dramatic shift in the kind of independent candidate that's getting elected that appears to be to the real detriment of the Liberal Party. Yeah, and this is resulting in new forms of civic engagement and political participation. The voices of groups, they're growing, they're spreading, they're organising at an absolutely unprecedented level. This has never happened in federal politics in Australia before, and it is oddly reminiscent of what occurred in colonial parliaments prior to federation with the non-Labor forces. They'd coalesce around a charismatic individual. They'd form these community groups, and then they'd further organise together, which eventually resulted in the creation of the Liberal Party. That's a whole other tangent. I suppose that's kind of it from me so far. there's so much more detail I could go into with all of this. I'm sorry it's been a bit harried and slapdashed and jumping from one thing to the next with only very tenuous logical leaps. But yes, I'm more than happy to take questions about anything. I've got 1,000 different graphs and polling data and all kinds of stuff like that. So thank you very much, guys. I'll hand it over to you, Aidan.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was a wonderful presentation that you gave us there. Just letting the audience know that feel free, we've got plenty of time to pose questions, so drop them in the chat box below. We'll start off with just a question, Patrick. So what do you think were the main points that brought the voter confidence and anti-party malaise, as you said, in 2017-18 that saw the public opinion sway toward about 41% in the Australian electoral system?
You mean what do I think altered the people's satisfaction in democracy, dropping down to 41%? That's a really good question. I think that look, the researchers who were doing that particular research, whose names escape me, I could check it, but I can't because PowerPoint is blocking all my screens. Their theory was that it had a lot to do with the combative attitudes in, according to their surveying anyway, the combative attitudes that people often see within Parliament. You know, that question time is just this kind of arena to fight in. It's not really about, you know, it's not about, I don't know, talking about local football clubs or engaging more with their local electorates. You know, it's just about parties having it out at each other, playing football, as it were, with the issues of the day. That was what they really, you know, that was what they really thought. I think from my perspective, I think that how to phrase this? I think that people get frustrated with the major parties because everybody is often hungry for a kind of representation in their leaders, in the people that they see as, you know, as being their people. They're hungry for a kind of representation that often you can't get in a political party. You know, in a political party, being given a safe seat because you're a party functionary who's fought for the past 30 years to tooth and nail to climb their way up through the hierarchy of the Labor Party, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that you're a particularly endearing individual to the electorate to which you were given. So I think that probably has a lot to do with it. The fact that often electorates are seen as just as a prize that's passed around. Again, you know, speaking to this kind of perception that it's all a game to the major parties, and not, you know, and not this, I suppose, really important job of representing this community, of making these people feel like, you know, they are included within some kind of organic decision-making process within Parliament. You know, it doesn't endear itself to that. It's also just a function of the fact, I think, that we have huge electorates, right? That often incorporate many different communities that may have nothing to do with each other. So it can, you know, one of the things that Voices for Indi did was that they did a lot of work trying to connect all of the different parts of Indi together to make them feel like Indi, right? I mean, how many people ever can really say which electorate they're in? It changes half the time because redistributions are always happening. So I think that also, you know, that also contributes to it. This kind of this malaise, this feeling that, you know, they're dissatisfied with their democracy. Yeah.
Great. We've got a question from Arthur. Thank you for the talk, Patrick. Has the rise in independent voting transited primarily into an increase in voting for extremist groups or individuals, or has there also been an increase in voting for more politically moderate or issue-specific individuals?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There's a lot of work being done by some of my colleagues at Monash about, you know, those more extreme candidates. It's really hard. Look, I'll be honest, it is very hard to actually know if there is an increase to and I'll try and explain why, if there is an increase to the amount of votes that there are for really extreme candidates, because there's so little information often available in each electorate for every single little independent who's kind of standing up and putting their hand up. So it is hard to say whether or not, you know, there are more extremist independents out there. There has certainly been a rise in the number of minor parties on the right who were standing up at election. That really began in 2010, 2013, and you really see it in the Senate as opposed to in the lower house. Because of course in the Senate, because of the kind of voting that exists there, you know, there's proportional voting as opposed to first past the post preferential, like, you know, that we have in the lower house. In the Senate, it's easier to get elected, which is why, you know, One Nation are there, and Palmer was in there as well. So there is definitely an increase in the kind of right-wing minor parties that are you know, putting their hand up. I would actually say that the second part of was it Anthony?
Arthur's question.
Arthur. Sorry, Arthur. The second part of Arthur's question is probably the more true. I think that there has been an increase in the, you know, the issue specific, often, even if the issue is we hate the local member, issue specific independents, both standing and getting elected. You know, they're moderate as well. They often, moderation is actually, anyway, this is getting into a lot of what my research is about. Moderation is often their numero uno value, right? And it's not called moderation, it's other things, you know, about integrity and about, you know, being fair and honest and you know, not being too extreme. It very much speaks to, how to put it, in terms of Indi at any rate, it very much speaks to you know, that kind of the small town community, very Protestant value of you know, of moderation, all things in moderation, of being polite, of being, you know, pleasant, these kind of things. So you can definitely see that, right, with Stegall and Haynes, and particularly McGowan. McGowan is like, you know, case number one for that. She was literally called in the Indi elections quite often, you know, the auntie of the electorate, because she was seen to be, you know, all of those things. Whereas Mirabella, you know, seemed to be pugilistic and harsh and, you know, unfeminine as well. There's a whole other analysis there too about women in the Liberal Party too, but we may not be able to go into that. But yeah, so to answer that question, I think that there is an increase, particularly with, you know, who's winning in these moderates, taking Liberal seats.
Thanks for that answer, and thank you, Arthur, for the question. Chloe has a question. Hi, Patrick. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have a question more geared towards the future. Although it is difficult to make long-term predictions, do you think the current shifts and developments you have discussed will continue, and what do you think the situation will look like in 30 or so years?
Thank you, Chloe. I love that question. It's a great one. It's one that we're discouraged from answering too much in our theses, so I love talking about it when I get asked it, particularly when nobody can respond. No, I much prefer discussion. But yeah, so to answer your question, look, I think that this could take off if it is done strategically. That this movement that's occurring within independent politics, that seems to be occurring at a local level, in local electorates, in local communities, it could really take off, because I do think that there is red hot frustration out there in the electorate, as you can see from those, you know, the data, about major parties, and there's fertile ground onto which, you know, these groups can kind of sow this idea of a community-minded independent. And, you know, we can't forget that the Liberal Party, and to a lesser extent the National Party, they were formed out of these kind of groups back in our pre-federation parliaments, and indeed in our federation parliaments as well. You know, the Labor Party is a very old party, but the Liberal Party is a very, you know, considerably younger, and that was because it was took a long time to coalesce from other various different groupings, and we could, you know, be seeing the beginnings of something like that again. Yeah, so these independents who come in and take these safe major party seats, who form this, you know, these campaigners around them, these campaigning groups around them, these nascent parties. And you stay there for a long time, who become so entrenched that they can then pass it to the next person, and may end up coordinating together in Parliament and forming their own, more national party. It's entirely possible that that could happen. Having said that, I think that there are a couple of really big obstacles. And the main one is the one that always exists for independence, which is that it's expensive, and you need a lot of experience to, around you. You need a lot of luck too, because even with that anger, it's still hard to garner enough of a primary vote to be able to win. And you can generally only win on preferences even then. And finally, it requires a certain set of conditions. And this is another thing that I've looked at a lot. And one of the primary conditions, I suspect, is that you need to have a really bad member in there already. So it seems to be that it's only when one of these electorates, like Indi and Warringah, and in a slightly different situation, and Wentworth, there needs to be anger about the local person, the local member. There needs to be resentment against them. They need to be, they need to be seen to no longer be representative of their people. That's the trend that we're seeing for these people, these independents actually getting elected, is that there is a shared kind of narrative that occurs when you ask people about, why Indi shifted after being a safe Liberal seat for 40 years, or 30 something years. Why did Warringah shift after decades and decades and decades? Why did Wentworth shift after like 100 years or something? And it's always because they felt like they were no longer represented by their natural party, because of the local member. So, it would be, many of these groups are forming in places like Goldstein and North Sydney, that might not necessarily have a particularly terrible member. Like Trent Zimmerman is a fairly, he's a moderate. He's, by all accounts, fairly pleasant, and seems to have a good relationship with his electorate. So I don't see them being able to win in those scenarios. Craig Kelly, though, is another matter entirely, and Hughes, the electorate of Hughes, that could be the next place where they might be able to gain a foothold. And then it's just all about defending their territory as they go, So in answer to your question, I think it's possible. It's entirely possible. But is it probable? Probably not. The weight of history is against them.
Excellent. Thank you. Got a question from Marcus. Hi, Patrick. Thank you for your insightful points. With the Liberal Party now on a very slim majority after the cabinet reshuffle, what are your thoughts on major party strategies to defend and gain seats from independent candidates in the near future?
That's actually a really interesting question. I think that, look, if we look at Indi as an example, because that is the electorate where all of the normal conditions for a party to win it back from an independent, at least according to conventional wisdom, to the past axioms of how we understood how independents work. 2019, that was the situation in which the Liberals should have been able to just, snap it in. They had a good candidate in the form of a local small business owner, Steve Martin. He was young, charismatic, pleasant. He wasn't offensive. He wasn't a hardline right winger. McGowan was gone. She'd stepped away. Haynes was relatively unknown, and it's a seat that they've held for decades. And it was also an election in which there was a surprise Liberal win, right? And they really peddled that line about the fact that independents can't, they can't do things in Parliament. If you want to get things done, you need to have a local member who is part of the major parties who will be in government. And that tends to be a really persuasive line, particularly once the former independents left, and you no longer have Sophie Mirabellas there, causing people to continue to be pissed off. But they didn't win. They lost it again. They didn't lose it. They couldn't regain it. Haynes won. She took a slight hit to her primary vote, but it wasn't anything catastrophic, and she romped it in. So I think it's real. Look, I'm not a campaign strategist either. So I know a couple, but I wouldn't know where to even begin as a major party. trying to win back those seats. Now, after seeing that in 2019, I think if you throw enough money at it, and you throw enough expertise, and you start trying to play their game, the game of the independents, about trying to select somebody who is a local-minded, a community individual, trying to rebuild your branches there, trying to reconnect people with the Liberal Party, with the Liberal brand in those electorates. You know, I would think that might be how you would win, but the problem is it's hard to do that for all of the points already mentioned. It's, you know, major parties, they have to appeal to an enormous cross-section of the electorate. It's the great advantage of independence, is that they can just appeal to you, just your electorate. So, you know, frequently they'll have questions that you know, that they won't be able to respond to, or that they won't be able to respond to, or that they'll have to say, oh, well, you know, that's the party line. I'll do what I can when I'm there. And look, a really charismatic individual, somebody that people really identify with, could be able to make that work. But I think if 2019 has shown us anything, they have to be really damn skilled. So yeah, look, the other way that could occur is that whoever the local independent is could be disgraced. You know, have a Tony Windsor moment of supporting a Labor Prime Minister when you have a nationals electorate. Those kind of moments can also be where the majors can reclaim a seat. But yeah, I other than that, I'm not quite sure what you would do these days to try and get them back.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Turning back to the more taking on the question of democratic deficit, in your opinion, how do politicians and their constituents address and/or resolve democratic deficit, and how important is mainstream and digital media in this context?
Yeah, look, again, that's a really good question. Independents have done this by using exactly what you just mentioned then, Aidan, which is, you know, digital and mainstream media, and of course, you know, the often maligned social media, you know, connecting with people on these platforms, and they've done it really, really well. It was one of the things that's very notable about McGowan's win in 2013 was her presence and the Voices for Indi's presence, particularly because of all those young, highly educated professionals who begun Voices for Indi, how engaged they were online and using digital, you know, these nation builder, these digital tools for connecting with people, for campaigning, for organizing, for consulting as well with the local electorate. So I think that's you know, that is definitely one blueprint for how people might go about trying to reconnect, trying to solve this kind of this malaise, this anger, this feeling of no longer being represented. I also think that it's really, really difficult to do.
Yeah,
and
so on. Make sense?
Apologies. You can continue.
All right. Yeah, no, so I think, look, I as well as all the stuff we've already talked about political parties and the difficulties that are, you know, inherent to them trying to reconnect, you know, with people, I think it's also just the nature of huge democracies, right? These are enormous democracies like ours or America's or, you know, India's or, you know, Japan's. You know, these huge institutional organs that are required in order to administer, to support, to service the population often mean that there is this huge gap between local citizenry and the people that are making all the decisions, right? There's this feeling of this kind of inorganic, you know, machine that sits there between you and power. And I think that really does contribute to this feeling of not being powerful, of not being included, of not being represented, because there's all this machinery in the way. And parties also, you know, sit there too. People always talk about the party machine. You know, it's all in the words. It's people, you know, view them as these inorganic things that are blocking them from that kind of grassroots identification that I think they really crave. So yeah, I think that I suspect that anything, the digital media and social media, because of the fact you can beam it straight into somebody's household, that may be one of the solutions. Of course, it comes with a whole lot of caveats and problems, but that could be one of the solutions to solving this problem. But I think it's just the nature of gigantic populations of humans. And it's not one that I'm an expert enough to solve, that's for sure. Unfortunately, I wish I was. I could, we could solve a whole heap of problems. There are several great academics who have written on this too. Kaz Mode, I think his name is, who writes on populism. Francisco Peniza as well, again, writing on populism, and they speak about this. Nadia Urbanati as well. And they talk about this malaise of people no longer feeling like they're part of power. And it leads to kind of these populistic situations like we've seen on and off for the past 30 years. Anyway.
Thanks for that answer. Our final question, with the time we've got left, from Mitchell. Hello, Patrick. Thank you again for speaking at our event today. My question concerns the trends which might be present internationally. Your expertise is within Australia, of course. However, I'm curious if there are currently any global trends which align with those you've described.
The dreaded question. Extend your analysis outside of Australia for somebody doing Australian political science. Look, I'll be honest, I can only really speak to what I've read, and a lot of what I read is based in the past as well. And a lot of what I read is really relating to Westminster democracies as opposed to others. So I can't even speak to what is occurring in America, because of the fact that their systems of election are so different to ours. And so the types and kinds of independence that they get are different. I mean, their independents become Democrats and end up, trying to become president in terms of Bernie Sanders. So yeah, I can't speak too much to that. What I can say is that one of the really interesting things that I found in my research is that while these party or nascent parties that are cropping up around independence, while they're pretty new here, there is precedent for them in the UK. And independents in the UK, particularly at a local level, have seen a similar thing occur in the past 30 or so years. There's been some really good work done on it. I can't tell off the top of my head, by some English academics who have looked at this same trend of they call them fake independents because they have a party, so they're no longer independent. But they're seen as these kind of independent groupings that have kind of taken off over the past little while. Speaking more generally, I would say that at the end of the day, as much as there is a lot of rhetoric about the rise of independence, and even there's a bit of rhetoric in what I'm saying as well, about these groups taking off. Ultimately, the thing about democracies, the thing about representative democracy, is it tends to lend itself to party politics. So even if, let's just extrapolate out into the future, so imagine if there's 50 independents in 20 years' time in the Australian Parliament, how does anything get done? Yeah. How are decisions made? How do you form government? You form government by finding like-minded people to organize with, to say, right, we'll all vote on this if you do X. Yeah. So, and this is how parties are formed, right? This is how it happens. This is how it starts. So I think even if there is an increase, it'll just be part of a pattern. It'll be an increase, and they'll then either bleed back into the parties they came from, or they'll form new parties. I think independence is very much a phenomenon that ebbs and flows because of this, because of just the nature of representative democracy and making decisions and governing.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So that about wraps up our tonight's event. Thank you ever so much, Patrick, for this engaging dialogue and taking the time to be here. To our attendees, thank you for watching, and I hope you benefited from tonight's event. If you haven't done so already, be sure to follow our social media accounts for upcoming events, news, and to post feedback. Additionally, you can express your interest to become involved at IAPS on said mediums as well. thank you once again, Patrick. We are grateful for your presence here and your participation. Hopefully we see you again at IEPS soon. And to everyone else, take care and have a good night.